Hi, this is Daniela, and welcome to Bestie Life, the podcast, where we help you stop burnout now. If you're tired of running on empty, juggling all the things, and wondering when your life is supposed to feel better, you're in the right place. This show is your go-to space for real talk and practical strategies to help you protect your energy, create balance, and actually enjoy the life you're working so hard for. You'll get a mix of solo episodes and honest conversations with guests. My goal is to help you feel less alone, more empowered, and way more in control of your time and energy and well-being. So let's get into it. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I want to talk about something that I've been noticing over the last few years. It has to do with the way companies are approaching their wellness programs. Now, before we go any further, I don't necessarily think it's because organizations don't care about their people. Most leaders absolutely do care. But I think between facing tighter budgets, increased pressure to justify expenses, and a bigger focus on initiatives that produce measurable business outcomes, the reality is wellness programs aren't always taking the approach that's actually going to be the most transformational. They might be looking at the one that gives the biggest bang at the moment, that seems the most exciting, that makes you feel good at that moment, but that doesn't mean that it's addressing that burnout. It doesn't mean that burnout's going to disappear once that program's over. People aren't going to be necessarily less stressed or sleeping better or more energized or finding more balance because they had one great 1-hour workshop that made them feel good at that moment. What concerns me is I think we spend so many years talking about burnout from a motivational standpoint. And so when we look at wellness as something that just motivates people, that doesn't mean it's going to help them, find that success. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that people need to be more disciplined or more organized or more productive or more resilient. Burnout isn't a motivation problem. So much of it, it's a biological problem. It's driven from our nervous system, our recovery issues, and our capacity. And if we keep treating it just like a motivation, positive, feel-good type issue, we're going to keep giving exhausted people solutions that don't actually solve the problem, but just feel good in the moment. So today I want to unpack what burnout really is, why some traditional wellness approaches often kind of miss the mark, and what actually works, and why I believe we're entering a new era where people need clinically effective wellness support that really moves the needle now more than ever. So grab your favorite beverage, grab something to write with, and let's dive in. Now, let's start with something really important. Burnout is not just stress. Stress itself, it's not the enemy. In fact, it's a normal part of being human. Stress helps us meet deadlines, helps us perform, helps us react when something requires our attention. So the goal is not to eliminate stress. The goal is to recover from stress. And that's where I think so many people get into trouble, because burnout isn't caused necessarily just from having a stressful week. It isn't caused by a busy month. Burnout develops when stress continues for so long that the body and brain stop getting the recovery they need. Think about, your phone battery. You can run it down during the day. That's normal. But imagine using your phone all day and then only charging it to 40% overnight and then using it again the next day. And then maybe only charging it to 35% overnight and then maybe only 50 and then 20 that next day. And still you're trying to go through an entire day without coming in with a full charge. And eventually you start operating from that partial charge all the time. And that's what so many of us are doing with our bodies. We're getting enough recovery to survive, but not enough to really restore our energy levels. And over time, that starts showing up in ways that people don't always connect to burnout. You start to forget things. You struggle to concentrate. You might reread the same email 3 times and still not remember exactly what it said. I do this all the time. You walk in a room and you forget why you're there. You lose your patience more quickly. I know I was irritable when I was going through my burnout, constantly overreacting. And that emotional reactivity is something we definitely have to be aware of. You might find you're procrastinating on tasks that normally wouldn't bother you. and you just feel exhausted all the time, but you can never seem to fully relax. And a lot of times we might label that as, people are just getting lazy, they're not motivated, but that's not the case at all. What's happening is their nervous system is becoming overloaded. When stress becomes chronic, and we normalize that as our baseline, your brain starts shifting resources towards that survival mode. The part of your brain that's responsible for planning, focus, your creativity, and decision making doesn't perform as efficiently when we constantly are in that state. And that's why when people are experiencing burnout, so many times you'll hear them say things like, I just don't feel like myself, or I used to be able to handle so much more than this. I don't know why simple things feel so hard. And it's not because they suddenly became incapable. It's because their recovery capacity has just been completely depleted. They are running on empty. Another great analogy that I heard that kind of describes this, it's like, imagine you have a bonfire and you're putting more logs on the fire, and that might be the things on your day-to-day list. And that fire, though, it's blazing, it's red, it's burning hot, and the more logs you put on, the more energy it consumes. And when we get to a point of burnout, it's where we've stacked so many things. If you're ever good at making a bonfire, you need to space the wood in a specific way. You need air to be able to go through. So you need some space, you need some breathing room between the logs in order for the fire to continue burning. When you just stack things on top of each other without any space in between, that's where you can then hit burnout, because there's no air, there's no breathing room. And that burnout state where you're completely depleted, your recovery capacity is gone, that's those gray ash embers at the end of that fire. And I think a lot of times when we talk about wellness and recovery and burnout, our conversations don't get that deep to really get to, not just managing the logs as you're building that fire, but what to do in order to keep from getting to that burnt out place at the end. A lot of times people say, well, just take a deep breath, or practice gratitude, or download a meditation app. And don't get me wrong, I love these things. I think they're fantastic, and they are absolutely a part of those practices to create that space and breathing room. I love meditation and gratitude and yoga and wellness challenges and all those kind of things. But the thing is, those individual activities, while a part of the burnout intervention, is not the whole intervention. And I think that's where sometimes we get a little confused, because they're not the same thing. A lot of times, especially workplace wellness programs, they focus on what looks healthy rather than what creates the measurable change. So they, might have lunch and learns, they might do step challenges, go for walks, bring in motivational speakers. Like I said, I've done this before and been a part of it, where, you talk for an hour, everyone feels great, they have a good idea in their head of what it could look like, and then we're gone. Meditation apps, I love these apps, but for someone to just download it and then not really be guided on how to integrate it, that's where then they end up never opened, never used, but organizations feel like they kind of check that wellness box. And their people, unfortunately, are still feeling the same way and drowning. Why? Because a lot of, like I said, these initiatives, they address the symptoms of how you're feeling at that moment, rather than really looking at the causes and going backwards as far as looking at what brought you there and creating the transformation over time to undo and keep you from getting to those symptoms. Imagine someone carrying around a 100-pound backpack every single day. Would teaching them a breathing exercise help? Maybe a little, but if they're still carrying the backpack, the root problem remains the same. And that's what I'm seeing so many people experiencing. Their workload remains the same. The expectations stay the same. The constant accessibility expectations remain the same. So you're still carrying that mental load, but then we're surprised when a wellness webinar doesn't solve the burnout. You look at that list of things that I listed that still say the same. Burnout isn't happening because we lack information. Most people know they should probably sleep more, they should exercise, drink water, manage stress. Like I said, information isn't the issue. We all have, I think, so much information when it comes to self-care, boundaries, time management, all these kind of things. But the implementation of all of these pieces, having the capacity and the recovery time in order to put them into place in a way that is going to be strategic and integral in order to make that transformation is what's missing. And so it has to be about not just looking healthy, but about functioning better in our day-to-day life. Because nobody comes to me and says, well, I don't think I'm doing well because my gratitude journal isn't pretty enough. They come to me because they're exhausted, because they can't focus, because they feel disconnected from their families and their jobs and their lives and who they are, because they're successful on paper but miserable in practice. And that's a completely different problem. And that's why it requires such a different solution than just a healthy looking activity on the outside. So you're probably thinking, well, if doing those kind of wellness isn't enough, what actually is going to work? And the answer is change that's rooted in science. I work with so many people where it's not about getting another self-care checklist. It's about a system and practical strategies. They need approaches that are going to work on Tuesday afternoon when life is messy. The dog just, I have a new puppy. The dog just had an accident in the house. You're trying to get dinner ready. You're running late for soccer practice, all those kind of things. And that's one of the first things we look at is kind of having an awareness of where your stress is coming from. So many people, I think, we're used to just operating under pressure that we don't even always recognize when we're stressed. We just think that's normal life, that level of stress is so normalized. That's your baseline, that's your identity, that's who you are. That's why so many times when you ask someone how they're doing, they're like, good, busy. That just becomes, they're functioning at that constant state of activation and they don't even realize it. And so then the next thing we look at is recovery. Not relaxing, but actually recovering, because there's a difference. Relaxing is great. It can help give you a sense of calm. It can give you some recharge. But recovery actually restores your function, replenishes your energy at a higher level, improves your resilience, and allows your nervous system to shift out of survival mode. And so that's when we're going to start to really focus then not only on that recovery, but then the actual change. Because here's what I've learned. The best strategy, it's not going to be the most impressive one. It's not going to be the fanciest, most glamorous looking thing, but it's going to be the one you actually do consistently. And I've said so many times before, tiny changes repeated consistently are going to outperform dramatic changes that are typically only last 2 weeks. We see this so many times with New Year's resolutions. People set these huge lofty goals like they're going to transform and revamp their entire life, and that then they're not able to stick with it. And this happens if they're trying to change their sleep, their movement, their boundaries, their stress management. We're all carrying thousands of decisions every single week, and every decision requires energy. Every unfinished task is taking up some of your mental space. And so sometimes we don't need more to do, more productivity tools, more steps to take in our day. Sometimes it's as simple as fewer mental burdens. When we look at boundaries, it's not because they're trendy or anything like that, but because they are so effective at reducing unnecessary stress exposure. You've probably heard people say every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. Every time you say yes to something that doesn't align with your priorities, you're spending energy, and energy is not an unlimited resource. And so the goal isn't to create a stress-free life, because that's basically impossible. The goal is to increase your ability to recover from the stress that life is inevitably going to bring you. And that's resilience. Not pushing harder, but recovering better. When I talk about finding that work-life balance, the 4 main principles that we just kind of touched on a little bit are how you adapt, pivot, have resilience, and boundaries. So, what does this all mean? Ultimately, I think we're entering a really interesting period. Because while organizations are still dealing with burnout, employees are still struggling, and healthcare costs continue to rise, mental health concerns continue to rise, many employers are now becoming more selective about what they invest in. And honestly, I understand why, because I think, as I've said throughout this episode, we've spent so much time investing in wellness initiatives that feel good, that look great, but don't necessarily produce the long-term meaningful outcome that we're truly looking for. And I think what we're going to see moving forward is a greater demand for these types of interventions that actually work. Programs that are going to improve behavior, programs that improve recovery, improve performance, and improve your well-being in a measurable way. And while, granted, your business, your companies, all organizations have a role to play in this, you also have your own personal role to play. It's not one or the other is responsible. They work in tandem, because waiting until you completely crash is expensive. It's going to cost you physically, emotionally, relationally, professionally. And most people, when you wait until they're completely depleted before they take action, you're then trying to catch up from years of accumulated stress. I'd much rather help you strengthen your capacity before you reach that point, because burnout prevention is always going to be easier than burnout recovery. Always. So if you've been trying to self-care your way out of burnout and it hasn't worked, there's a reason. Okay, self-care is great. It's an integral part of that burnout prevention and recovery, but on its own as a standalone, it's not enough. It's a tool to help create some temporary relief rather than lasting recovery. So it's not just about getting another inspirational quote or a gratitude journal or an app that you forget about a couple days. It's about integrating approaches to help your brain, that mindset part that we always start with. How you think creates how you feel. And when you feel differently, then you can act differently. Also, the way you think, by changing those habits, is going to change how your nervous system is functioning on a day-to-day basis. Because like I've said, burnout isn't a motivation problem. It's not a character flaw. It has nothing to do with being weak or anything like that. It's just basically a physiological response to and what happens when stress consistently exceeds the recovery and the recharge that you're getting. And the good news is you can rebuild that recovery capacity. Resilience can be strengthened, boundaries can be learned, habits can be changed, and balance can absolutely be created, not through perfection, but through intentional adjustment across those three pillars: mindset, time planning, and self-care. So hopefully you were able to kind of recognize a little bit about what's happening right now in the industry, to see a little bit about more of what is going to make the change, what's going to move that needle. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who appears to have it all together on the outside, but might be running on empty behind the scenes and needs to know it's not their fault, that it's okay, and that we can help them. And if you're ready to move beyond surface level wellness and start building the capacity to thrive, I'd love to help. So until next time, take care of yourself, not because it's another thing on your to-do list, but because your well-being is the foundation that everything else is built on. Take care and talk to you soon.
Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you got something out of this episode that really made you feel seen, supported, or just a little bit more grounded. If you have any questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. And if you're up for it, please leave me a 5-star review. That will help more people find the show and join this community. I'll leave you with 2 of my favorite quotes. Alone we may be strong, but together we're stronger. And when we support each other, incredible things happen. So let's keep showing up for ourselves and each other, and maybe even have some fun while we're at it. I'll talk to you soon.